Hi everybody, welcome back. Well, today I thought I would just talk about some Stephen King. Talk about some of my favorite deep cuts from Stephen King. Deep cuts, B-sides, or whatever you want to call it. Maybe some works of Stephen King that aren't talked about as much as some of the other ones. Although Stephen King, pretty much everything he's published is easily available, but nevertheless, there are some books he's written that you don't hear about as often as the others. So I have 6 books here, and I'll just go through them and talk about them. I'll go in chronological order. So the first book I want to talk about is Night Shift. This was Stephen King's first short story collection that was published in 1978, I believe. A lot of the stories in here were written before King was well known, before he got famous, when he was still, sending off his stuff to pulp magazines and things like that. But I think Night Shift is a great introduction to Stephen King, especially to early Stephen King. His style, what his writing was like in his early days, and I know the argument's been made that Stephen King excels more at the short story than the novel, and I think there's something to that. But I know each decade he would usually put out a collection. I know in the 80s, Skeleton Crew, Nightmares and Dreamscapes in the 90s, Everything's Eventual in the 2000s. So I always like that he would do that every 10 years or so. But in Night Shift, there's just a lot of memorable stories in here. Jerusalem's Lot is the first story, which is a prequel to Salem's Lot, and that's a cool story. There's Night Surf is in here, which is sort of like almost like an outtake from The Stand, kind of, or almost like condensing The Stand into a very short story with Night Surf, which is cool. There's what else? Yeah, a lot of these are classic. I read one last night, Battleground, which I had forgotten about, which is kind of a weird little story about. It's like The Man with the Golden Gun meets Small Soldiers. It's just kind of a strange story, but somehow it's kind of a fun one to read. Let's see. Sometimes They Come Back. I like that's a good one. Lawnmower Man, classic. Everyone, Lawnmower Man. Yeah, Children of the Corn, another classic. And the last story in this collection I also read, The Woman in the Room, which I think is sort of almost an autobiographical story for Stephen King about the relationship with his mom, and that is a really emotional story, and I think that's a really strong story. One of the better early things that King wrote. So that's Night Shift, an early collection. Next, I'll talk about Cujo, which this was published in the early 80s. Yeah, 1982. This one's pretty well known. Cujo, about known for a novel about a rabid dog that begins to terrorize a community. This is a Castle Rock novel, and I remember reading the book though, and I was not expecting a lot when I read this book, but it's actually it's much more. It's about much more than this dog that terrorizes the community. It's about this family and the dissolution of this family. You have the husband who works in advertising, and he's caught up in this scandal, and his wife, she's unhappy in the marriage, and of course there's a young boy as well. So it's a really, I think, especially in the mid 80s, early 80s, King was really writing a lot about nuclear families coming apart. I mean, The Shining, the most famous example, Pet Sematary, another another novel in that mold, and Cujo is really, I think, good about the disillusionment of middle class in the 1980s. I think there's a really interesting theme there. Well, it's also just a really, I think, visceral novel. King famously wrote he doesn't recall writing Cujo because he was under the influence at the time. So, which made me think, well, maybe this book's not that good. But it's actually, there's a real kind of ferocity to it that I like in King, and that it works. So that's Cujo. To jump ahead to the 90s, this is one I recently read, I think this past summer, Insomnia, which was published, I believe, in 1994, I want to say. Yeah. This is, in the 90s, King was starting to stretch a little bit. He's writing a lot of novels with female protagonists like Rose Madder or Dolores Claiborne. With Insomnia, his protagonist is a man in his 70s. So that's kind of uncommon in a horror novel, especially a big horror novel where the protagonist is someone of older than the usual protagonist. Ralph Roberts is the character's name, and it's about he's a widower and he is having strange dreams. He's having sleeping issues, and yet he begins to feel a little bit younger as the story moves along. There's also this novel is set in Derry as well, so there's a lot of connections to It, of course, the famous Stephen King novel. And he's having these strange dreams. There's also a lot of controversy happening in the town with the issue of abortion. It comes up in the book a lot as well. So there's some of the cultural battles of the 1990s are addressed in the book, stuff that is still very relevant today. And there's also, not to get into the Dark Tower, but there's a lot of connections to the Dark Tower series with Insomnia as well. But I just really like the book following this protagonist in his everyday life. A guy in the 70s and dealing with grief, dealing with what to do with the rest of his life, and all that. So I enjoyed Insomnia for the most part. I feel like it's got a lot going for it. Let's see, next one. Talk about, find it here. The Girl Who Loved Tom Gordon. This was a shorter novel King published. This came out in 1999. I feel like with this book, this was King almost kind of trying to test himself a little bit. This is almost reads more like a YA novel. It's a very simple story about a child, a little girl in this case, who is on a hiking trip with her family, and she ends up getting lost in the woods, and that's the story. It's about a little girl who's lost in the woods and trying to survive. I found it kind of a moving story on a lot of levels, and like I said, King just trying to tell the most basic story imaginable about a child who's lost, and I found it really effective. Some might consider this a slight entry in the Stephen King canon. Of course, the title refers to Tom Gordon, who was a pitcher for the Boston Red Sox in the late 1990s. So there's a big also baseball parallel with the book as well, and King weaves that in nicely as well. So, Girl Who Loved Tom Gordon. And kind of continuing on with the baseball thread with Stephen King, this is a nonfiction book he published in the 2000s called Faithful, which he co-wrote with Stuart Onan, which is basically kind of a diary King and his co-writer kept of their passion for the Boston Red Sox during the 2004 season. But there's also a lot in here. King, this is after his accident. He is also finishing off the Dark Tower series. So you get a lot of stuff with what was going on in King's life at this time. But it's also a chance for him to kind of, geek out on his passion for baseball and for the Red Sox, especially. I always feel like sometimes that doesn't come up a lot with Stephen King about how influential baseball is to him and how it comes up in a lot of his books. And, he's often not thought of sometimes as a sports writer. I was thinking he's never really written a novel, like an epic baseball novel, as far as I know. I know baseball has played a part in a lot of his stories, but I feel like that's something worth exploring more. King's his fascination with baseball, but like I said, you might have to be a big baseball fan to enjoy this book. But if you're a Stephen King fan, you can give it a try. But yeah, so that's Faithful. And one more I'll talk about. This is a later Stephen King book. This is Revival, which was published in 2014. This was recommended. I've heard various Stephen King fans recommend this one as a really underrated book, and I would agree. It is. I think it's an effective book. It's about, as most King's books are, it's set in New England, and we follow this narrator who is, he's a little boy, and he's in a big family, and Jamie is the protagonist. And when he's a little boy, there's this charismatic preacher in his hometown who kind of takes the town by storm a little bit, really revives the church in this town. And then a tragedy strikes for the preacher, and everything, he kind of loses his mind a little bit after this tragedy happens. And the narrator, Jamie, and the Reverend, who is Charles Jacobs, they cross paths throughout their lives. Like, the book starts out, I want to say, in the late 50s, early 60s, and they cross paths, and we learn about the Reverend, where he is getting involved with experimenting with electricity and supernatural stuff, doing, kind of Nikola Tesla stuff or something like that. And the thing that people talk about with this book is the ending, which I would not even begin to spoil, but a lot of people, and I would agree, probably the most disturbing ending in a Stephen King novel he ever had. It really sticks with you. It really gets under your skin, I think, after you read the book. So yeah, Revival I would highly recommend as a good kind of late Stephen King book as well. So yeah, so those are the books kind of review. So there's Night Shift, Cujo, Insomnia from the 1990s, and there's The Girl Who Loved Tom Gordon, and then kind of a parallel with it, Faithful, nonfiction book on King's fandom of baseball, and then Revival, which I just talked about. So would appreciate to hear any comments. Do you feel like there's a Stephen King book that's unheralded or deserves more attention than some of the greatest hits of Stephen King that come up a lot, especially this time of year? And do you have a short story even of Stephen King's, do you feel like that deserves a little bit more recognition, or at least deserves to be talked about more? So anyway, thanks for watching, and I will see you later. Bye.